Hello, I'm Faith Rogers, host of today's program, COVID-19, Keeping Up with the Moving Target. Thank you for joining us. This activity is jointly provided by the Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, DKB Med, and the Institute for Johns Hopkins Nursing. Today's program is accredited for ANCC, AAPA, and AMA-PRA Category 1 credits. Please visit our website for complete CE information. If you're tuning into our webcast, please click the Claim Credit button on the webinar console. Otherwise, please go to covid19.dkbmed.com, navigate to our multi-specialty episodes, and select the webinar to claim credit. Today's learning objective is to describe changes to NIH treatment recommendations for people with mild to moderate COVID-19 at high risk for progression. This educational activity is supported by independent medical educational grants from Gilead Sciences Incorporated, as well as in-kind support from DKB Med. With us today, we have Dr. Paul Auwaerter, Clinical Director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Auwaerter, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Faith. And I think many of us are breathing a sigh of relief that in many parts of the country, the numbers of newly infected patients in hospital with COVID-19 have decreased dramatically. So you'll see that many localities are dropping their mask mandates and so on. But of course, the virus is still quite present. There are some changes that might be important for you and your patients to know about in clinical practice. And certainly the virus is still quite prevalent and likely we'll be seeing cases through the spring to some degree. So I think it's important to highlight these for you. As many of you were aware, back in December with the initial Omicron surge, there was such a crunch because the monoclonal antibodies we were relying on, such as casirivimab, endivimab, and bamlanivimab, etesivimab, really fell to the wayside because of lack of activity. And the excitement about new oral antivirals generated a lot of interest, especially with the Paxlovid product. However, that was in such limited supply, there were scrambles to really try to target antibodies with effectiveness, which boiled down to just one, sotrovimab, which you can see here on the chart from HHS, which was issued in late December. And most of the activity recently regarding new or updated drug recommendations fall to the left part of this slide in mild to moderate outpatient therapy or for prevention, which we have discussed in prior webinars. The NIH has issued, based on available data, sort of graded recommendations with Paxlovid at the top, followed by the monoclonal sotrovimab by intravenous infusion, then 3 days of remdesivir, and finally the oral nucleoside analog molnupiravir bringing up the rear, mainly because that last drug seemed to be the least effective in clinical trials. So there certainly has been a change, but logistically, it's really only number one, the Paxlovid, which probably has the efficacy and the ease of administration. And although sotrovimab supplies have improved, there's still perhaps not been as widespread availability as it was previously when we had more monoclonal antibody products. So I think in recognition of the shortfall with monoclonal antibodies that are active against the Omicron variant, last week the FDA gave emergency use approval to bebtelovimab, a new monoclonal directed just like the others against the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, and much like others has very similar indications really for adolescents and adults weighing at least 40 kilos who have at least one risk factor for progressing to severe COVID-19, but who are outpatients. Now, this monoclonal does have activity against the Omicron variant, which we'll talk about in a moment. But unlike earlier monoclonals, there's really very limited data available, in part because this monoclonal was administered with an older combination, bamlanivimab, etesivimab, in a number of phase 1, 2 trials, but its activity is a single monoclonal where you really have limited data. And you can see from a phase 2 trial, which was mainly done for safety, the new monoclonal bebtelovimab was given to 100 patients, or bamlanivimab, etesivimab in 50, most of whom had high risk. On average, people had about 4.5 days of symptoms. So a bit later than we saw in some of the earlier trials, and some of the patients actually had already received some vaccine. The secondary endpoints, though, were the typical hospitalization or death by day 28. And there we just have very little data, where the single new monoclonal had 3 people who were hospitalized or died. That's 3%. The combination product had 4%, and there was 1 death in the single monoclonal alone. There was a little bit of other data from other aspects of phase 2 trials, either open label, where the monoclonal was combined as above, or in a low risk population, which is really not where this is targeted. The expectation is the safety of this monoclonal is very similar. And of course, because the drug does seem to work in vitro based on tests, I think the FDA made the calculation that this will likely perform as other effective monoclonals as long as they have activity. Now, where there may be some issues that I think we don't quite yet know how to handle is really with some of the subvariants that have derived from the original Omicron variant. And one in particular, going by the name of BA.2, has 20 different mutations from the earlier variant. And there's no way to really distinguish this without sequencing. So in real-time practice, we really don't know what people have. It has spread worldwide in many countries. In fact, in Denmark, has a substantial number of people with this particular infection. Now, it doesn't seem more virulent, and sequencing data from the United States shows in the pink that BA.2 is just a small percentage at this time compared to the Omicron variants in the darker purple colors, which certainly have completely replaced Delta in the orange since late December. So whether this has impact and whether it will grow remains to be seen. The WHO has not separated this out as a separate variant of concern. It's just under the Omicron umbrella at this time. But there are some nuances because of the changes in the spike protein in this subvariant. And in this paper, which is a preprint that is from China, looked at neutralizing effectiveness of these drugs relative to the original Wuhan strain. And what you can see is sotrovimab, which has been now the preferred monoclonal antibody, does have some reduction against BA.2. Whereas bebtelovimab appears to not be affected at all. Really, it's the only monoclonal. And I think for relative worth, it should be noted that we get concerned when you see in the many hundreds or 1,000-fold reduction in activity, which of course is what we've seen with Omicron with the Regeneron product, or the other Eli Lilly, the bamlanivimab, etesivimab product. But we haven't seen with sotrovimab, and does not appear to be the case with bebtelovimab. So I think if there were both drugs available, and it's not clear that they're in the hands of our distribution centers yet, but may soon be, if you did have a very high risk patient, there may be a potential preference for this new monoclonal marginally, but sotrovimab probably should work as well. Now, there have also been some changes in immunizations, and this has, I think, been confusing to many patients, and it's often hard to stay on top of these recommendations. But I think the few key ones I would want to mention were highlighted in a recent CDC broadcast. And that is for our severely immunocompromised populations, which have always had 3 doses of an mRNA vaccine as part of the primary series with a booster. The booster, the dose number 4, was recommended at 5 months, but there does seem to be waning immune responses by month 4, at least in the general population, and probably sooner in the severely immune compromised. So the revised guidance now are people are now eligible for boosters 3 months after an mRNA vaccine. So looking at the immunization schedule for the mRNA vaccines in the immunocompromised population, you have your first, second, and third doses, which should be characterized as a primary series. The booster doses now are 3 months after dose number 3. That's the minimum there. Now, for those who have received the Janssen vaccine, remember that booster dose was recommended earlier, and this should be an mRNA vaccine unless if it's contraindicated, because people have much better enhancement of their antibody responses with an mRNA following the Janssen vaccine. The booster dose now here for those who have received Janssen is at least 2 months after that additional dose. So this is where there's still the primary series is 1 dose if you can find it. And then there are additional doses. Now, there is a new vaccine, the Novovax, which is going to be applying for EUA approval. And this probably will be the alternative vaccine for those that may be wary of the mRNA vaccines. And we'll be speaking more about that as we get closer, or if there's EUA approval. Another was a common question that I had always been fielded is when to get a booster or a vaccine after you had COVID or you received monoclonal antibodies, for example. It used to be, oh, you should wait 90 days. There's really no rationale, I thought, because we used to give immunization and immunoglobulin together for rabies or hepatitis B. So the revised guidance now is no deferral period. You can get immunized. That is probably better to capture people at hand. But if you are using the tixagevimab, silagevimab, and that's the so-called pre-exposure prophylaxis product, you're supposed to wait at least 2 weeks in that particular circumstance before immunization. So Faith, that's all I have for this week in terms of updates, but I know there are a couple of questions we have.
Yes, there are. And the first one here is, do you suspect that changes will be made to the interval between mRNA vaccine doses for younger people?
So the whole issue of immunizations for the under 5 crowd, I think the move has been good. Pfizer has withdrawn their application, awaiting more data. Whether there'll be changes in terms of separating the doses out longer or for 3-dose series, especially for some in this age range, I think remains to be seen. It's likely none of the trials are nearly as extensive as we've seen in other population subsets, such as adults. So I think waiting for more data makes some sense. And whether there'll be changes, I think are likely, but luckily they'll be data driven rather than anticipating, for example, that there might be a 3rd dose required.
Great, thank you for that. And our next question, why is B2 considered a subvariant and not a new variant?
Yeah, Faith, I am not a virologist that's living and breathing these designations. It's still under the Omicron umbrella variant of concern. It's considered a subvariant because it's thought to be perhaps derived from the original Omicron variant, even though it's substantially different enough, as we just talked about, where some monoclonal antibodies are not recognizing it in similar fashion. I think because it may not be behaving differently in terms of the larger universe of vaccine responses or virulence, it's sort of living as a subvariant rather than being pulled out as something different. This perhaps will change if it becomes increasingly prevalent and maybe identify in of itself. It does seem to be just as infectious, even if not more infectious and transmissible than the original Omicron. So we'll see what happens over the next few months.
Okay, thank you again for those updates, Dr. Auwaerter.
Yeah, thank you, Faith, and I hope this was helpful to you all. And I also hope that we're seeing fewer and fewer cases of COVID-19 among our patients, but there's still opportunities to improve our practices, and for those that are infected, hopefully get the best available care.
If you're tuning into our webcast, please click the Claim Credit button in the webinar console to attest for credit. Otherwise, please visit us at covid19.dkbmed.com. Again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your dedication to your patients with COVID-19.